All right. So, in this video, we're going to continue talking about how 1848 informed the nationalisms that emerged after 1848. And in this case, we're going to take a look at the creation of Austria-Hungary. So, this should fall in the middle of our discussion of German unification because Austria Hungary's formation is kind of an offshoot or a tangent of German unification. So this is kind of a tangent away from that story, but it is related to all of the stuff from 1848. And so it does kind of fit into that narrative as well. So if we look at Hungary, which we haven't really ever looked at, Hungary is at this time, a piece of the Austrian Empire. And their nationalism awoke alongside the nationalisms of everybody else in Europe with Napoleon. So the nationalism awoke with Napoleon, and then the same kind of thing that we've been talking about happening everywhere else in Europe also happens in Hungary in 1848. And that's pretty much where our story is going to end up. But before we do that, because we haven't talked about Hungary before, I felt it's probably a good idea to do a little bit of background about Hungary and how they ended up to be a piece of the Austrian Empire. So let's start this by looking at the end of independent Hungary. Now, the first thing about Hungary and the Hungarians is that they don't call themselves Hungarians. The Hungarians call themselves Magyar. And so Hungary is a weird Anglicization or Anglicization of what they call themselves. So they don't call themselves Hungarians, they call themselves Magyar. But with that unique feature aside, the Magyar were not really any different than any of the other Eastern European people. So they were more decentralized. The nobility had more power. And up until about the 1500s, the Magyar were feared warriors, and they had a decently sized country. All of this kind of came to an end in 1526. In 1526, the Ottomans invaded Hungary. And in the ensuing battles, the young king of Hungary was killed. So, the nobles, who get to pick who the ruler of Hungary is, the nobles were persuaded to elect his brother-in-law to be the new king. Or at least the new king of the territory the Ottomans didn't take over. And it just so happened that their new king, the brother-in-law of the old king, was also the leader of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor. So, at this point, Hungary is folded into the Austrian territory, but not the Holy Roman Empire. So that's when, if we jump way ahead to 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire is dissolved by Napoleon, Hungary is still attached to Austria. Because they weren't part of the Holy Roman Empire, they were part of the Austrian piece. All right, so all of that now done. Let's jump ahead to 1848. So in 1848, the same thing happens in Hungary as we saw happening everywhere else. Hungarian nationalists and Hungarian liberals initially kicked out the Austrians. Then they started fighting each other. And that leads to the Austrians coming back. Aided by the Russians, who want to stomp out any and every nationalist and liberal revolution that they can get their hands on. So between 1849, when the Austrians came back, and 1866, when Austria-Hungary is created. The Austrians ruled Hungary through martial law, basically meaning that the military controls Hungary. So for this 17-year period, the Hungarians are treated very poorly by the Austrians. Okay, so let's jump ahead now to 1866. Remember that this event is taking place in the middle of German unification, and this stuff is happening right in the middle of that process. So there are 3 wars of German unification. This happens right at the end of the Second War, which we will cover completely when we talk about German unification. So in the 1860s, Prussia is using nationalism to grow and expand their borders and their power. Okay, so the Prussians are using nationalism to grow and expand their borders and their power, and to do that, they have to fight Austria, and in 1866, they defeat them. For Prussia, Austria is their biggest rival, and if they're going to expand Prussian power, they have to knock the Austrians out. So they have to fight the Austrians. So the Prussians beat the Austrians, and we'll talk about that when we're talking about this in the context of Prussia. But here we're talking about Hungary. So what effect does this have on Hungary? So now pretty thoroughly defeated, the Austrians look really weak to the Hungarians, who have been treated very poorly over the last 17 years. It's also the case that the Hungarians make up a big percentage of the Austrian army, including a big number of officers. So the leaders of the Austrian army, maybe not the guys that are like in total command, but a lot of the mid-level guys are Hungarians. And the Hungarians now smell blood in the water. They want to get out from under the Austrians. For one, they want revenge. And secondly, it looks like the Austrians are going to pull them down with them, and the Hungarians don't want any part of that. So the Hungarians start pushing for independence again. And like I said, that's for 2 reasons. They want revenge, and they want to get out before the Austrians drag everyone down with them. Looking at this from the Austrian point of view, the Austrians know they're weak. And granting independence to the Hungarians would give ideas to all the other nationalities within the Austrian Empire. And so they can't do this. They can't give the Hungarians independence because it would make the Austrians look weak. So, in 1867, we get the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. In German, this is called Ausgleich. So you might see it described that way too. You might see this described as the Ausgleich. So this is the compromise. Austria and Hungary would be co-equal parts of the empire. The Austrian emperor would be the leader of both pieces independently. So he would be the Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary. But they would have separate governments. They would have separate parliaments and separate policies. So they'd have basically their own set of laws, their own parliament. They just share a leader. They would also have a common military and foreign policy. So anything that happens in Austria is separate from what happens in Hungary, but to the outside world, they would have a common military and a common foreign policy. But in all of this, remember that there are no such things as Austro-Hungarians. If we're thinking about this in terms of nationality, there are no Austro-Hungarians. There are Austrians and Hungarians. So if we're thinking about this in terms of nationality, we've got Austrians and Hungarians, no Austro-Hungarians. At the time, this worked. This worked at the time because it placated the Hungarians to a point. But it's also going to set the stage for a lot of other conflicts. This really angered Hungarian nationalists because what they wanted was an independent Hungary. And they're not going to get that until after World War I. And jumping ahead even further, this is also going to lead to anti-Soviet demonstrations in 1956. So the Hungarians just want to be independent. They want to be left alone. And they're not going to be happy with the Austrians being in charge of them. They're not going to be happy with the Ottomans being in charge of them. They're not going to be happy with the Soviets being in charge of them. They just want to be independent. The other set of seeds that this plants that are going to be problematic later on is that there are lots of other nationalities that resent the Hungarians and feel this settlement was unfair to them. And so other groups that we might think about in here Czechs, Slovaks, Serbians, Croatians, among others, and they're all going to be upset that the Hungarians get special treatment. Why don't they get special treatment too? And so this resentment is going to lead to Serbian nationalists becoming radicalized, and eventually that's what's going to spark World War I. But we'll worry about that when we get there. So this is leading to a bunch of long-term consequences to try to fix a short-term problem. So this should fall right in the middle of our discussion of German unification. And so in our next video, we will go back to the end part of the wars of German unification and talk about the Franco-Prussian War. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.